Eric Bischoff believes an error for the Bloodline story in the third inning is okay. The Bloodline was one of the most dominant factions in the history of professional wrestling, as each member succeeded in their respective fields and were elevated to a whole new level. Now it appears Eric Bischoff believes an error in the Bloodline storyline right now is okay. Paul Heyman recently stated that they are only in the third innings of the Bloodline Saga. This was preceded by WWE's decision to have Jimmy Uso betray Jey Uso during the latter's match against Roman Reigns at SummerSlam. This decision was criticized in a major way by fans and critics alike. While speaking on the latest episode of the Strictly Business podcast, Eric Bischoff discussed Paul Heyman's third innings line. Bischoff stated that he believes an error in the Bloodline storyline right now is okay. To me, there's nobody more creatively right now than Paul Heyman. But if we're in the bottom of the third, let's go from a baseball analogy to a traditional storytelling analogy. If you're in the middle of Act 2, which I guess is as close as I can get to equating the bottom of third, if you're early in the story, as the third inning would represent in a baseball game, you're still in the early phases of that game, or in this case, story, you've got to advance the story. You've got to advance it in a way that it's escalating, it's building. That's why they call it an arc. So Paul's analogy of being in the bottom of the third inning would suggest that he's just now closing up the first act. If that's true, oh my gosh, these people should be winning Emmys at some point because they've done such a phenomenal job. To suggest that you can't strike out in the bottom of the third, or you can't hit a pop-up fly in the bottom of the third, or you can't commit an error in the bottom of the third, and still win the game and win the World Series, let's not get too confused about where we're at and concerned about whether or not they can continue. I think the creative team has demonstrated, without question, that they have the ability and the understanding. Perhaps they just committed an error because perhaps they couldn't really think of a finish to this that was more dramatic, or maybe they just put all of their eggs in the Jimmy turn, assuming that that would be the moment, the dramatic moment in the match, which it could have been and arguably should have been. It just wasn't. It could have been the way it was executed. Perhaps, hindsight 2020, everybody's got it. Doesn't take a half an ounce of experience or talent or creativity to criticize something after the fact. But perhaps as they analyze, and I'm sure they are, and discussing, okay, that really wasn't what we hoped it would be, or could be. Perhaps they're looking at the execution of the turn and going, we could have done that better. We could have done that differently. I'm sure they're going back and they're analyzing, even while it was happening. There's a lot of very, very, very experienced, talented creative people back there watching in Guerrilla. I would not be surprised if back in Guerrilla they were watching along with everybody else going, that was kind of flat. No big deal. An error in the bottom of the third, or at the end of the first act, as the case may be. There's another inning coming up. Let's get the team together, let's focus, and let's move on. Bump in the road. I don't even know if it was a bump. They ran over an empty can, made a little noise. Let's move on. I'm still very, very optimistic. But I was let down. I thought that match to me was the least interesting and compelling thing on the entire card. I thought everything else on that card was better than that. Jey Uso announced that he quit WWE on last week's episode of Friday Night SmackDown. He was also moved to the alumni section after this announcement. We'll have to see how WWE will continue to develop the Bloodline storyline in the coming weeks. What's your view on what Eric Bischoff said? Do you agree with him? Let us know in the comments.